that we've learned how to properly open and close a file, let's dig in on how to read and write them. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to read files using the read, readline, and readlines methods. We're going to learn how to iterate over a file using the for loop. We're going to learn how to write to files using the write and writelines method. And finally, we're going to learn how to work with byte files using the b file permission option. So let's get started. When we want to read files, what we want to do is use one of three methods that the file handler gives us. There's the read method, there's the read line method, and then the read lines. The read method is going to pass, when we pass in a value, it'll give us back the size, give us back the content based on the number of bytes we pass in. So if we pass in 1, it'll just give us 1 byte, typically 1 character. If we pass in 4, it'll be 4 characters. If we pass in nothing, then it'll just give us the entire file as it is, and we'll be able to work with the entire file in there. So be careful. If you have a very large file and you use the read, then all of a sudden that's going to get loaded up into memory, and that's going to be quite a tank on your memory. So beware of that. The read line will just read at most that number. So it will read at most a line. Now, if you pass in a number into that, then it'll read the number of bytes that you pass in until you get to the new line. And then once you get to the new line, so say you have a line that is 6 bytes and you grab 4 bytes the first time, and then you ask for 4 bytes again, it'll grab only the 2 last bytes that are in that line, and then you give that to you. And then when you call read lines again, it'll wrap around and give you the next line. Then finally, read lines actually converts all of the lines in the file into a list that you can then iterate over that in there. Now, you can actually use the read method to read the entire file, like I said, in there. Just beware, again, that if the file is really large, then it kind of becomes a big memory hog into your program. So here we have an example of the read. We pass in our path, and I notice I'm not using pathlib this time. I'm actually using a string. I pass that in. I'm just using it as with the read permissions, and all I'm doing is just reading it. And I literally just call the read method, and that just dumps the entire file as if that you would see that in there. So there we go. That's for that one. Now, if we use the read with a parameter inside of there, so we're passing in just 4 bytes in there. So what I'm doing is I'm passing in I'm printing out what read of 4 bytes would be, and I'm wrapping that around with a quotation in there to kind of show you what's going in there. So when I talk about a byte, it may not be necessarily a character that you see. As you can see, here's a white space that's in there, right? So it's literally just whatever that byte value would be. That includes other white space characters, such as like a tab character, so the /t you would see put in there, and also the end line characters, so /n and /r/n, or just a /n, depending on which system you're working with in there. Next up, we have the read line, and as you can see here, I've got a read line here where I read just a single line and then read another single line, and then this time I just read the first 20 bytes of that line. Now, if I call read line again of 20, it'll print out the rest of that line up to 20 bytes, and if there's even more bytes, then it'll keep going until it hits the end, and then it wraps around and gets to the next line that's in there. Now, you'll notice that when I print this, so I wrap this around with quotations, what got happened here is that quotation isn't here, and that's because there's a new line character. You don't see it, but it actually is there, and you can kind of see that it's kind of there. You know that it's there because the quotation is over here, and then the other thing is you'll notice that a new line also comes in again. So we have a new line and a new line, right? And so what you need to be aware of is you do get the new lines when you grab the read line in there. So we could set up a print so that it doesn't do a new line every time it does that, but it still doesn't fix our issue here where we have a new line in between our quotations, right, at the end of our string. So let's look at how we can do that. Well, we can strip out the new lines in that file. So here I have a read line, just single line right here in there, and then I strip. So you remember that strip actually takes out any white space, and that includes new lines that are in there. So now when I print this out, you can see, hey, this actually works out the way that we would expect it to be. So now we've got this situation. Now in this particular case, I didn't do the just strip, and so it actually did render out the new line that was in there. So you can see that that does get wrapped around there. Finally, we have the read lines. So what I did is I actually just printed out the return of what read lines is, and you can see it's a list with each list entry being a new line. And you can see here now actually the /n, what actually gets printed out there. So when we were having issues earlier, you see that there was a space and then a /n, and that was a new line. And same thing here, there's a new line here, and that's why we ran into a situation like this, where you had this weird quotation because there was a new line here, and then you had a quotation and another new line right there, and then this right here and a new line right there. And you can actually see that new line character being rendered out here just to show you that that actually is in there. So one of the common things that you're going to want to do when you're working with a file is probably iterate over each line inside the file. And you can do that by actually doing a for loop over the file handler. Python knows that you can then just iterate over that. It's as if you called the read lines in there, but now you're just iterating over the file handler itself. You'll also notice that the new lines get rendered as well. So just because you iterate over the file handler, it does not remove the additional new lines that are there. And also on top of that, print, when it runs, it adds a new line. So we have a new line with a new line. So if you're ever going to print a file, even a partially file, out to the console using Python, beware that the new lines from the print and a new line from the file itself will be rendered. Now, if you're rendering, or if you're printing out a Windows file on a Linux, you have a new line with a new line and then an additional new line because you have that /r/n and then another /n at the end there. Now we can fix this in a little bit with a trick using Python by using the end parameter in Python. And basically what this does is says at the end, instead of printing a new line in there, just do nothing, an empty string. And now you can see this is exactly how the file would be presented if we just opened up the file itself in like a text editor that was in there. And that's how that works when opening up a file. So those are the main areas of opening a file and then iterating through it. You can either use the read lines, or read line methods to read that. Or if you just want to iterate over each line in there, then use the for loop over the file handler. Next up, let's talk about how to write to a file. So when we write to a file, we have to pass in the W write permission. So that's your second parameter in your open statement. And you'll notice that I just have a pass. So a pass is essentially a null op. Nothing happens when we do that. This is literally the same thing as if we pass this path into the pathlib path and then used the touch method that was in there. It would do the exact same thing. It just opens up a non byte-sized file and just leaves it like that. And remember that if we open this file and that file already exists, the previous contents of that file will be erased. Now, a file handler has two different methods that you can use for writing. You have either the write, and you pass in a string and it passes in there. Now, when you use write, it does not add a new line to it. It is your responsibility to add a new line character at the end of each of your strings that you want to be new lines to. And then also you have the write lines in there. And also it's important to note that no line endings are placed in between there. So if you pass in a sequence, so a list of, let's say, 5 strings, and each of those strings don't have a new line at the end of them, they will not be have new lines. They will be just appended to each other in the sequential item that's in there. So let's take a look at that and see how that exactly works. Let's go back to our example here where we open up our Kronos coders file, right? And we check to see that that exists, and we know that it does, and that means it's going to erase it. And what we're going to do here is let's create a list of so numbers is going to equal this, and then for num in range 10, we're going to do numbers dot append str of num. So we're just going to have and in fact, let's do this outside of this right here, since we don't need the file to work with this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out our numbers just to show you what that list looks like. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to do writer.writelines. I'm going to pass in my numbers. Okay. And then we're going to look over here to see what that looks like. So let's run this, and you can see it printed just 0 through 9 without anything in there. So that means that every time this it wrote this numbers, so we have this list of numbers in here that are strings, it just printed that straight into here with no new lines. If you want a new line in there, then you have to add that new line character, and we can do that with just the /n character in there like that. So let's rerun this again. And here we can see the string that actually got printed, or that got put into there. So we have a 0 new line, 1 new line, and that's exactly what got sent to the file itself, like that. So that's what writelines does for you. Now, if we do write, what it does is it's just going to write out the actual text of it. So here I have a string. This is a test of the write method, and you'll notice that this is a new line character that's in there, right? And so we print that out, or we write that out to the file in this test file, and then we read it, and we can see what it looks like, and we're printing out exactly what we see there. Okay. Next up, we have this guy, which is the writelines, and again, because we have the new line character in there, it is getting written out there the way that we would expect it to be. So finally, in this lesson, we're going to talk about working with bytes. And working with bytes means that sometimes files aren't necessarily like regular text files, the way that we would kind of expect them to be, like the CSV or .text or just plain, even JSON is kind of a text file. There might be something that's like a byte. So those might be image or video or audio files, or even executables, and trying to open those up. Python can still read these, but you need to open them up in kind of a different way using the adding the B to the permission string. So here's an example. Let's say we have our file and our text file, and we open up in the bytes array. Now you'll be able to see that when we print each line, it's actually a byte string that's in there, and it's different. And then you can actually see that there's a new line being rendered there. So now it's actually just printing out the string, not necessarily the byte string, and not necessarily what you would normally see in the file itself. And you also notice that some things are actually converted over to hex values. That's because those are Unicode values that were encoded in there that needs to be then changed. So when we print it normally, they get rendered out as something different in there. So in this case, it's going to be, let's look at this, what it would normally be. So it's the ellipses. So that code is actually the code for the ellipses right there. That's the Unicode value for ellipses. So that's what's getting rendered there. Now let's take another example. Some files might not even have line endings in them, and most likely you need to kind of rethink how you want to do that. So we're going to go back to our NASA logo portable network graphics file here, or PNG, and we're going to open this up in Python. And you'll remember that in one of the previous lessons, we opened up in a hex editor, and we just kind of showed the contents, or a hex dump in there. Let's look at it using a byte file when we open this up. So here we've got our path right here using our path lib. I'm going to pass this in, and then I'm going to read it with the B that's in there. And that's going to be showing the bytes in there. And then what I did is I printed out those magic numbers that are in there. So we have the magic number that we expect to be 89, then the PNG values in there. So the values for what PNG would render to. And then our CRLF, which is our DOS style new line, and then our DOS command that basically tells it to stop printing the contents of the file. And then finally a Unix style command, which is your LF. And now if we print this, we can see that these 5 characters, or 5 sets of bytes, actually do get printed out, and we can see them. And you can actually process the full PNG file using that way. You can do that within Python and figure out, okay, how do I, what is the next format of the next set of bytes, and start reading through that and actually kind of iterating through that for you. So that's the basics of reading and writing to a file. In our next video, what we're going to do is we're going to do some in-class assignments on working with these files and how to read and write with them.